This morning I am in Salt Lake City, Utah, speaking with Melissa Bernstein, who is the director of the James E. Faust Law Library at the S.J. Queeny College of Law of the University of Utah. She has been here at the university since 2012 and also is a professor of law. Melissa, it's our custom to begin these by sort of finding out a little bit about you or whoever I'm speaking as a person, as opposed to just a law library director or whatever. Could you tell us a little bit about your life, perhaps not only today, but even when you were younger?
Sure. I was born in New York City, and at the time we lived in Long Island. But when I was very young, we moved to New Jersey. I grew up in Paramus, New Jersey, which is famously known for shopping malls. There's no sales tax on clothing in New Jersey, and so
that must be nice. Everyone must come from across the river.
Everywhere I've gone, people say, "Oh, you're from Paramus. I shop there." So that's where I grew up.
Sort of was life early on. Huh?
Yeah, that was life early on.
Well, more recently, you ended up here, I guess.
That was an indirect. That was a very indirect route, I would say. I started out, went to college and law school, and had always wanted to practice law, and so I did for a number of years. I started out in New Jersey, and I wasn't super happy with what I was doing. I decided that I wanted to maybe practice corporate law. I moved to that, and then New Jersey wasn't particularly compelling. So I moved to New York, where there was a lot more corporate work going on, and I did that for a while, but I was never quite satisfied with that. Then I really wanted to leave the practice of law, I think, or figure out what else I could do. And my mom was very worried about my doing that. She really didn't want me to. And
Parents often worry about such things. They figure you won't be able to make a decent living or
exactly.
something.
And so she kept saying, well, why don't you go in-house, or, this kind of thing. And at the time, it relied very much on headhunters, and I gave no thought to what else I wanted to do. I basically said to the headhunter, just find me something that's not practicing law. And so at the time, I was working on a very particular type of transaction, and I guess it was popular, and there was an investment bank that was looking for somebody to do that. So I wound up leaving that and going to an investment bank. And that was kind of like going from the frying pan into the fire. I really was not, and what they really wanted, I thought I was supposed to be someone who was sort of helping to close transactions, and since I knew the legal side of it and what was involved, I could basically harass the lawyers and make sure they were doing what they were supposed to do and keep the transaction moving. But that's not really what wound up happening. They were really looking for people to bring in business and do marketing, and it was not a good fit. But not long after I started at the investment bank, this was pretty much, I started in May of 2001, and my mother also lived in Manhattan, and she lived very close by to me, and she worked downtown. She actually worked in the World Trade Center, and she was there on the morning of September 11th.
Oh, I'm sorry
and she actually died there.
Yeah.
And so that was not long after I started in this new career, and it was tough at that point. I stayed at the investment bank basically for 2 years, but my heart was not in it, and that really made me question everything in life. And it was sort of like, well, what do I want to do? And the problem is I had always wanted to be a lawyer. So it's not like I had some great career to fall back on that, oh, I wanted to be a musician and now I can really pursue my passion. No, I wanted to be a lawyer. So I really had to think about what else I wanted to do. And kind of long story short, that's how, there's a little more to it, which we'll probably get to, but that's kind of how I wound up becoming a law
librarian. I may
librarian.
open the door to that right now, because you are one of only a couple of colleagues that I've known well enough over the years, or enough about, to know that they are sort of in the family business, so to speak. Your uncle was Julius Mark, who was for many, many years the director of the library, or law librarian, I think that was the term in those days, at New York University School of Law. And then later went on to one of the other schools
St. John's.
after he was retired from New York U because of age-based retirement in those
Yes.
days. He went on for an even longer, a few years at St. John's as head librarian. Julius, for those who have not are not familiar with him, was very prestigious in a very prestigious position, of course, all those years in New York. And he was also a leader, a major leader in our profession and in our association, serving, among other things, as president of AELL and as a member of the inaugural class of the Hall of Fame as well.
Yeah.
So, he's been around. So it's a wonder you didn't sort of have that in the genes. Well, maybe you did underneath.
Well, it's kind of funny how it all happened. So when I took some time off and tried to figure out what I wanted to do with my life.
Mhm.
And, this is an interesting thing when you meet people who don't really understand the legal profession very well, because people will say to you, oh, well, why don't you become an environmental lawyer? Or why don't you become, and they don't understand that it's not really translatable. You can't practice in one area and then suddenly it's like, they're not going to hire me as a family lawyer now. They just don't get that. So I pretty much realized that I had to reinvent myself.
Mhm.
And if I wanted to do something else, I was probably going to have to go back to school.
Mhm.
And so I thought about, well, what did I want to do? What did I really enjoy? And I realized that I always loved libraries. The librarians in school always knew me. And I did some research and found out that it was actually there was going to be a lot of promise possibly in the profession, because librarians were going to be retiring. I looked at, the labor, one of the labor departments online had some statistics about it, and so it sounded promising. Before that, actually, I thought about going into publishing, and that was
That
very
would be
short-lived.
A little like your work before you went into the law librarianship. There'd be the profit motive staring at you every day.
And I realized that was just not that was an industry that was very much contracting. So
Yeah.
it really was not a good idea.
Mhm.
So I wound up applying to library school, and when I did, I had the intention of becoming a children's librarian when I
Mhm.
went to library school. And I applied to two schools that were commutable, which was Pratt and Rutgers. Actually, no, I didn't even apply to Rutgers. I looked at the two schools, Pratt and Rutgers,
Mhm.
and Pratt did not require the GRE if you already had a graduate degree.
Okay.
So that decision was
Became
pretty
an
much
easy
made for
decision,
me.
huh?
And Pratt was actually a lot more commutable. I was back in New Jersey, and Pratt was more commutable for me.
Uh-huh.
It's downtown Manhattan. So I went to library school fully intending to become a children's librarian, and those were the classes that I was going to take. But in the summer of my first year, I had signed up for a class to take and whatever. And that summer, I actually fell and broke my ankle.
Oh.
And it was a pretty bad break. And so it affected, I had to drop the class I was taking. And then as the next semester rolled around, I needed to add a class just to fill it out. And there was a class on law librarianship, and there was a prereq for it, which I hadn't taken yet, but I figured, let me add this. I'll talk to the professor. I got special permission to take the class since I already was a lawyer.
Mhm.
And I figured it would be an easy class, which it was, right? Because I already knew the material pretty much. And as part of this class, we had an assignment to go and talk to the director of a law library. And it didn't matter, public, private, what kind of law library it was. And at that point, I was doing my homework for the class. They had cross-registration with, I think, Brooklyn Law.
Mhm.
And most people had to go to Brooklyn to do their assignments. But for me, that's like a 2-zone commute. I'm going from New Jersey to New York to Brooklyn. And I was like, that's not going to work. I had a good friend from law school, who was a professor at NYU. And so somehow she got me a pass to use their law library
Mhm.
because it's private. So I was doing my homework there anyway, and I said, well, let me reach out, and with my uncle being the former director and everything, I said, I'll reach out to the current director and see if I can do an interview. So I reached out to Radu Popa and sent him an email out of the, my uncle, I don't know if you knew my uncle, he was the director, and I get this lovely email back from him, I loved your uncle. I didn't even know if he would know who he was, but got this lovely email, and we set up an appointment to meet. And so I was interviewing him and chatting with him about the questions that we were told to ask for this paper and whatever that we had to write. And one of the questions was, if I wanted to do this as a career, what would you recommend, right? And so I asked this question really not out of personal interest at that point. It was really because of this paper I was writing. And I said, what would I need, if I was interested in doing this? He said, well, you would need experience. And he said, we'll give you an internship. And I wasn't asking for an internship. I thought this was very nice. And I said, oh, great, and I started thinking about it. And I said, I should take him up on it, right? Because I have nothing to lose. I can try it out. There's a program at Pratt. There's a way that you can turn it into, you could get credit for it. There's like a classroom component associated with it. So I was like, there's nothing to lose by doing this, and I could try it out. And so that's pretty much how it happened. I wound up having an internship at NYU Law Library. And when I did that, I realized this is a really great fit. I've got both of my degrees, and even though I knew my uncle was a law librarian, I just had never entered my mind that that's what I wanted to do. And
Probably
so,
like most young members of the family, you don't pay really that close attention to what older members do for a living. They work, and then you see them other times.
right, I knew about it, but we had never really discussed it in depth.
So Julius didn't recruit you into the profession
He
at
did
all,
not.
at least
He
not
did
in
not.
direct fashion.
No, but
Yeah.
then at the time I was driving his car. He had passed away already. And my father bought his car from my aunt because he was the only one in the family who drove. So at that point, living in New Jersey, I was driving his car. And so I laughed with, they have a daughter, so he has a daughter, and I would laugh with my cousin that I think from driving his car and all of this that and then going to NYU that he was guiding me from above, but that's really how it happened.
Well, it's quite possible. One never knows for sure
Right.
about these things.
Right. So that's how I wound up becoming a law librarian.
Well, that's interesting. Now, I noticed when you took your first position in a law library, after getting the library degree, you moved to the Tarleton Law Library at the University of Texas in Austin.
Yes.
And of course, your director there was none other than another major luminary in our field, Roy Mirsky.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about that experience, including maybe something about what it's like to
Yeah.
work for Roy, who was a very close friend of your late uncle at that point?
Well, that was another sort of thing that I never expected to happen on many levels. Being sort of a tri-state, and I realize tri-state has many meanings now, but New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, growing up in that area, I never expected to leave. My whole life was there. My friends were there. My family, for the most part, was there. But at the time that I graduated from library school, there really were not jobs in the New York, New Jersey area. And so at law schools, because that's pretty much what I had decided that I wanted to do. And so I had to expand my search, which was kind of troublesome to me, in fact, because, I never expected to leave. And for me, there were certain regions of the country or areas that I would probably be less comfortable with, so I wasn't really looking in those areas. And I was fortunate in that I was still interning at NYU at the time. So I had them sort of help me, because going into the field, I knew nothing about it, and which would be a better place to work, and they helped me looking at the jobs that were available and whatnot. And there was this job at University of Texas, and I remember Radu said, "Oh, you should apply here," and he was a very good friend of your uncle, and this would be a great fit. And so I sent out my cover letters, and I'm not stupid. I put in every single cover letter that my uncle was Julius Mark, because I
Sure.
said maybe
Why
somebody
not?
knew him,
You wanted to get
right?
a job, you had to present yourself in the best possible of light.
Exactly. So I put that in, and quickly got a call from Mr. Mursky. I know people call him RMM, but he was always Mr. Mursky to me.
Well, I remember touring that library some years after I was in the field, but the people with whom I talked on the entire tour always referred to him very carefully as Mr. Mursky.
He was
Never by his first name, never by anything else,
Nope.
and he wasn't even around to catch
no,
them.
he was Mr. Mursky, and then I guess I learned a lot of things about how this was conducted kind of after the fact,
Yeah.
that this was pretty true to form. So at the time, I was not planning on going to AAL. It was in St. Louis that year.
Mm.
It was would have been my first one. And I was not planning on going. And he called and said, are you planning on going to AAL? And I said, well, no, I wasn't planning. He said, well, basically they wanted to meet with me there. And so I said, all right, I guess I have to go.
Mhm.
So I signed up, and whatnot, and went to St. Louis, and I met with them there.
Mhm.
And then was invited back to Texas, I guess,
Mhm.
for an on-site interview. And at that point, I really thought that this was an interview, right? I was conducting the interview and whatnot. And then I guess I found out after the fact that he had already pretty much made up his mind
Well,
before I went.
You know that actually you were not unique in any sense of that. He had a committee often to sort of be the front to handle the interviews and so on, but it was what Roy Mursky decided that prevailed.
Oh, I learned that pretty quickly.
And he was a quick decision maker often.
Mhm.
He didn't sit around pondering and looking at all the information. He sort of made a judgment very rapidly. He spotted talent. He went right for it.
And he was funny because I also learned he's kind of notorious for his thriftiness. I'll put it politely. And so
That's
the fact that
why
I
he wanted you to come to St. Louis for the meeting so they could interview
Exactly.
you without spending any money on getting you someplace.
Exactly. Yeah, so I kind of learned that. But what was it like to work for him? I don't think I had the true Roy Mursky experience because I had him in the twilight of his career.
That's
And I
right.
think he was a kinder, gentler soul at that point, which is still probably not what you would think of him as. But the bark was worse than the bite at my point. And so I could see what people were talking about in some of these stories, and we never had a per diem at conferences. Some of that stuff really is true. But he was a wonderful mentor, I think. He really pushed for, he was hard, but he was fair, and I think he very much advocated for his law librarians. He wanted us to be included in faculty lunches and all those sort of things, and really, I think he would sort of defend us in as much as also he gave you a hard time about, certain
Well, the
things.
stories
So-
about Roy are legion, as you can well imagine. But one that was very true was that he looked out for the people who came up under him. And unfortunately, his death before you got to that stage
Right.
has denied you that.
Yeah.
He helped him find positions,
Yeah.
gave him very good advice, and continued to be available.
Yeah.
But the other side of him that a lot of people don't realize is that how he truly cared for the people that he considered proteges, and followed them in almost a father-like way
Yeah.
in their careers. And that's the story you don't hear about the man
Yeah.
too often.
And I definitely felt that from him, and I don't know if it was because of the connection to my uncle, but I felt that part, and he was getting sort of weaker and frailer in his later years, so you saw more of that vulnerability. And then one of the things that I got to do, for good or bad, he was kind of a hoarder. he had a lot of things. And he collected free things, anything that a hotel gave away for free. He took, 6 of them and whatnot. And so after he passed away, Terry Martin came and worked at the Charlton Law Library for a couple of years while they were looking for a new director.
That's right.
And he had a lot of stuff. Not Terry, Mr. Murphy.
Right.
And so what they had to do is when Terry came, they had to clean out his office. And all of his stuff was upstairs in the law school, and someone needed to go through it. And I don't exactly know why, but none of his family members and his wife at the time, she was from Australia, and she had gone back to Australia. And so there were all of these belongings of his that somebody had to go through. And so I went through a lot of his boxes and learned there were so many interesting things about him that I would never have known. Not just his service in the Army and all that during World War II, but then there was also, he was quite the civil rights fighter. He was down there for the marches, and I mean, so really, and we also found, it was, during the Red Scare days, and he was on all kinds of lists. There were dossiers on him, and so I really got to see some of that history after he passed away by going through his
he was targeted by some of the conservatives in the Texas legislature back in the late 60s. When I was at the University of Houston, that's how I happened to see all this and hear about it. They were convinced that there were some dissidents at the University of Texas that needed to be sort of eased out one way or another. And what they tried to do was get authority for the legislature to set individual salary lines, which they had not had and didn't get, actually, unfortunately. But they were going to use that to essentially urge certain people to leave the state, go up, Yankee Town or something, like New Jersey or someplace, where they could be as liberal as they want.
Right.
But, so that was an interesting thing. And there was in the alum news magazine for the University of Texas, there was a graphic on the front page showing the law school leaning to the left. And it had articles about some of what was going on behind the scenes. But Roy was very much part of that in his day. Yeah. Very much. Well, you eventually left Texas and came here. And that was, again, back in 2012.
2012, yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about all the fun you're having here with the new building and everything else?
Sure. Coming here, and it was a director job, which, I was thrilled to have, but also, somewhat, a little bit intimidated. It's kind of a big job to step into and be responsible for things. Yeah. And I had been, the former director, who I know you've spoken with, Rita Roosh, had been here for 26 years.
That's right.
That's a really long time. And so I guess I was fortunate enough, they really wanted me to come before Rita retired. So I came like 2 weeks before she left. And I felt like a vulture. It was ridiculous. They set up a table basically outside of her office, and she was busy cleaning out her office. And I sat at this table, like I said, feeling like a vulture, like ready to swoop in. But part of it was just to talk with her and get some history and find out how she did things. And as she was going through her files, she'd be like, oh, this is probably something you're going to want. And, so she did give me some background, and that was very useful. But then I started. And it was talking, I guess the first thing I did was just talk to everyone. It was a small staff, so that made it easier. But talk to everyone and find out, what do you do here? And, how do things work where you are? And I guess it was another piece that made it tough was that there were some other staff members who were kind of close to retirement age. And there had been one gentleman in particular who did... he was a librarian, although I don't think he technically had his library degree. And he did not have I think he was, 2 credits shy or, one of those sorts of things. And he did not have a law degree, but was probably one of the smartest people around, right? And he did pretty much the collection development. He was the government documents librarian. He did a lot of the ordering, and
pretty key person.
He was very key,
and he's getting ready to leave for retirement.
He was getting ready to leave, and he was supposed to leave. And as a matter of fact, Rita convinced him to stay longer because she said, you can't leave, like, I'm leaving, can you please stay on? It was like, this would be just really too much if they both left at the same time. So she convinced him to stay on, and I want to say it might have just been another 6 months. I don't remember if it was a full year or not. And so there was going to be a lot of turnover, you know, and so there was a lot that I really needed to learn or get my head around in a short period of time.
Yeah.
And so that's pretty much how it started. And then there was also, we actually got rid of, we had only had one cataloger, and finally she retired during that period. So it was really like the changing of an era in many ways. And the planning for the new building had already started. I guess they had already done the program phase, so they were on to kind of the next phase. And so I came in at that level. So we were already planning for the new building. So it was a time of a lot of change.
I
A lot of change.
Yeah. And you said you moved in just sort of in time so you could start fall classes in this building.
Oh, in this building, yeah. Well, this building took, I was 3 years in the old building
Uh-huh.
while this one was being built. And then Rita got out in time, boy. She didn't have to deal with the move. She's not stupid. So we had to figure out, you know, how to move. And the old building is right next door.
Yeah.
But moving is moving, right?
That's right.
I guess it was slightly easier because the books, for the most part, they didn't have to be packed up. They could be just kind of put on book carts and rolled over.
Although most library movers today actually use that technique. They put them on carts that are usually
Right.
the same length as standard shelves, and then they roll them into their vehicles
Right.
and roll them back off at the other end.
Right, but the nice piece was that we didn't have that transportation part of it.
Yeah.
But we had to figure out the move to the new building. And the new building is different in many ways. I guess one of the biggest is that the library is fully integrated in the new building. We have stacks on, the building is 6 floors. We have stacks on 5 of them. The former dean had originally wanted there to just be shelving in the walls, like all over the building, and as you can imagine, that was kind of giving us a little bit of a heart attack. The thought of
Yeah, it
just
would be.
books scattered willy-nilly around the building with no rhyme or reason, we were horrified.
Well, you wouldn't need a circulation department because things would be taken care of sort of informally.
Yes, yes. So we had that, and then the librarians sit upstairs with the faculty. They're also integrated, so we're not all in one place. We do have a public reading room, but otherwise there isn't a specific library, like a separate library space. So this was like a whole new paradigm, really.
Well, you know, it may be what we're seeing evolve in most other places now, where so much of the collection, at least that the students need, and to some extent the faculty, is on digital form. You don't need to have a place with all the books and all the people on one spot.
It's not quite there. It's funny, that was a similar question. I remember during my interview here, they were asking me about, you know, books and like, do we really need books anymore? And there is, I think there's still sort of people are somewhat misguided on that. I think not as much is available, you know, more and more is becoming available digitally, but certainly not everything is. And the stuff that we have to help our faculty find is the stuff that's not, you know, is not necessarily readily available. And there's more of it than you would think, you know, so there are reasons why this stuff is still around. And a lot of it is being smart about what you keep and what you get rid of because it is available in another format and accessible and whatnot. So we're really managing that transition.
Well, I know that one of the concerns that some of our colleagues have is that Lexis, especially at various stages in its being put together, the input was a little bit adventuresome in that they changed a few things here and there to make the language a little more up to date and so on, and so that some of the materials in that database may still be somewhat suspect because of that. So you need to have the real original source to verify that that is indeed what the judge said.
Right, right. And it's still, the law reviews are kind of a big I don't even know how to put this, but the law reviews are sort of a little bit behind the times, I think, in this, in that for their site checks and all that, they can rely on PDFs,
Yeah.
I think, but a lot of them still prefer the print. And so and they won't, I think they're even allowed to rely on some of the databases, but they won't do it until, everybody's waiting for somebody else to be the first one to do it. And so they're not doing it. And so they still require certain things that
Maybe
are
the students
tougher to
that
get.
do the blue book for citations figure, when in doubt, keep it the same, and then you can't get blamed for making a mistake of doing it differently.
Yeah. So that, they need to, that needs to progress a little more as well.
And yet it's interesting, one of the characteristics of, say, Hein Online, which has many of the periodicals, is they put PDF pictures of each page, so
Right.
that what could these editors really think ought to be different about
No, the
using-
Heinz stuff is acceptable, but it's
Oh,
some
is
of
it?
these other sources that
So
are.
it's the Westlaw and some of the others where you need to
Yes.
go back to the original. Okay,
Yeah.
that's good, because I know a lot of librarians are telling me they've weeded periodicals,
Oh, yeah, we
especially
have no-
because you don't need the original
Correct.
anymore.
We have any journals that are in Hein, we don't have anymore. So
Now, you are a professor. Do you teach here at the law
I
school?
do. I teach research.
Okay.
I haven't really taught substantive subjects here.
You probably had more than enough on your day job at this
Yes, I would say that for sure. But yeah, so I teach research. The way they do it here, I taught in the first year once, but I've got enough librarians to actually cover the first year
point. Uh-huh.
required class.
So
I
your
don't have to do
colleagues
that.
in the library assist in the
Yes,
teaching role in the
yes.
school as well.
Yes, the legal research is a required class first year, and it's taught by librarians. The way they do it here is the advanced legal research, the upper level class, is co-taught. So that actually is nice because it's not too onerous on any one person. So I do co-teach advanced legal research. I did teach a subject-specific class on business, corporate and business research. And what we're working on now is possibly making like a lab component to, they call it the business organizations class, which is like corporations. And I would teach that piece of it. So we're working on developing that lab for next fall.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like you have your plate full here at the university, but despite that, you have begun to become involved professionally in the broader profession outside of the institution itself. I noted in your background when I was doing a little research that you have been on the Depository Library Council to the director of the U.S. government publishing office. And you are, I guess, now the chair, because
No,
it
I'm
said
the-
chair-elect.
Right, I'm chair-elect, so I'm
Okay,
still
you're still
chair-elect. So I'm
chair-elect.
like the next chair. Right.
Okay, of the Legal Information Preservation Alliance.
Mhm.
And you've been involved in some of AELL's activities and so on. You want to talk a little bit about some of your professional involvement, but also perhaps why it is that you feel it important enough to take time away from, your rather heavy duties here to do.
I think I'll start with the last question. I think it's really important to be connected to what's going on in the larger profession as a whole. And it gives you perspective and things that you can take back to your institution. You wind up having too much tunnel vision, I think, unless you get out there. It's like the forest for the trees. This way you're seeing the whole forest and getting a sense of what's going on. So I think it's useful, just from a selfish perspective to bringing it back. But it's also really interesting. It also helps, with connections. It helps with networking. It helps also just broaden my own skill set, in terms of the areas, I think one of the frustrations I had when I first got started, and I think other librarians share this, you want to get involved, and so you sign up, I think they probably have more volunteers than are probably positions. So in the beginning, you're always like, sure, sign me up for something. And in the beginning, especially as a newer librarian, you don't get picked for anything, right?
right.
You try and sign up and you just don't get picked. I think Mr. Mirsky helped and was able to get us, and I know Terry Martin did as well, trying to get us assigned to committees for AAAL. And then one of the frustrations there is that some committees do more than others.
That's
And
putting it
so,
nicely.
yes, I'm trying to be very political here. Some committees do more than others, and so when you're all excited to be on a committee and serve and do something, and then you don't really do anything, and
You
then
never hear anything until they start putting together a so-called report to
right,
do it the next
exactly. And then you have this thing on your resume, and I'm thinking, I hope no one ever asked me about it because I didn't really do anything. So I was excited. I got put on the Government Relations Committee only for 1 year though, because someone else had to step off, and I got to fill the end of their term. And that's a great committee to be on.
That's
they do
an
a lot
active
of
one.
It's
Yeah.
a very active committee, and they do a lot of really good work. So that was really interesting. And that led to, I think that may be how I got, kind of under the radar of some of the government relations people, and was asked to, if I was interested in serving on DLC. So that's been terrific. And LIPA, I know Rita had been involved in LIPA, and we were also members of LIPA at my old library at Tarleton. And I just, I think I can't stress enough how important digitization and preservation are in this profession. And so to find a group that was really sort of working on this and interested in these issues was great. But one of the things I've noticed in the groups that I've been involved with is just that it kind of repeating what I said before, it just really broadens the vision of what's going on. And DLC is not, we are a depository library, and I would say, I don't know if all, but a lot of the law libraries are also depositories. But we're selective depositories, right? We get a tiny fraction.
Statute passed some years back that allowed law schools to become selective depositories for their libraries, even if there was a full depository in the immediate area, including on campus.
Right, and our main library is also a selective, and then our regional is up north. So just learning, being involved in this, boy, it's opened my eyes. I've just learned a lot about, it's just another area, the law and all of the government documents that we receive and whatnot. I mean, it's just part of this much bigger picture that I was not as informed about as I am now. So it's been really, really interesting. And like I said, I think it only serves the institution and the law library and the law school for me to be involved in these things.
Well, I share that view. I mean, we did the same thing when I was active. We became a depository as soon as we could after the statute had been passed. And our university library was not able to be a depository, and they were faculty elsewhere on campus from time to time who wanted to basically switch the depository from us to them. And I always used the fact that that wasn't lawful under the rules, although we shared information with them, and that actually was probably what they really needed. But,
right.
You know how it is on campuses and politics and between various faculties. Yeah. Well, you have, in addition to your professional activities, you've gone even farther. You have written somewhat. I noticed you've done chapters for the Fundamentals of Legal Research, both the 9th and 10th editions.
Well, you could probably figure out how that started.
Yes.
I bet you have a guess.
I remember a gentleman named Mr. Mirsky had something to do with that for a while.
Yes, and when we were hired, I was hired with another librarian at the same time, and Mr. Mirsky had basically, a lot of the people who wrote those chapters or who edited those chapters had some connection to him, right? A lot of us were his staff, and so there were chapters that needed to be taken over, and so he assigned me 3 of them, and it, I guess I've been fortunate in that the succeeding editors have kept me on. So
they have a good person, they're going to hold on to them if they're smart.
So that's been nice. But at Texas, writing was not required. Like, we didn't have tenure or anything at Texas. So there weren't a lot of opportunities beyond.
I suppose it also
fundamentals.
wasn't built into your workday that you would have time to do some writing. So
Exactly.
this was probably more on your time that you did a lot of this work.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
But
Well, you've done more than that, actually. You've made a few presentations.
Mhm.
You were a panelist at the Legal Writing Institute and workshop
yeah.
held over at UNLV, which isn't too far from here,
No.
but it's a long day's drive each way if you went that way. So that was back about 2014.
Mhm.
Are you involved in any particular writing project at the
Well,
moment?
I do have a project that I've. It's still in the conceptual and research phase at this
Mhm.
point, but I guess following up on my involvement with LIPA and my interest in preservation and digitization and just availability of the law, I am interested in. I don't want to be too naive here, but it's it's a little frustrating to me that there has not been a coordinated effort to try and make the law and especially historic materials available online in a digitized kind of format. And Hein is fantastic. The only people that have been able to do this are the commercial entities. Hein's been fantastic. LLMC is doing some stuff, but you have to pay to access this stuff, right?
Yeah.
And not everything is available still. So I guess that's a big area of interest for me. So one of the first steps in my research is to just kind of look at the various groups out there that are working on these types of projects and defining the scope of those. I know there have been several sort of registry attempts, and I don't know how successful any of them have been. And so that's where I'm starting. I've already had some conversations with groups that are working on projects and trying to get the scope of them and be able to present that. And like I said, my hope is that somehow I think all of these stakeholders need to get in a room and try and figure out how are we going to do this. But like I said, that may just be a little naive or too optimistic of me. But
Well,
that's where I'm starting.
it's the ideas have to start someplace, and some of them wash out in the process for probably good reason.
Right.
Others sometimes get developed.
Right.
So, that's all you do. And
Right.
you've got a long time ahead to
Yeah.
consider all sorts of possibilities over, whatever comes along and whatever the needs of the moment might be for,
Right.
For our profession.
Yeah.
Earlier, we talked about your uncle,
Mhm.
Julius. Is there anything about that you had wanted to add? Because actually, in the original script, this is where I was going to actually bring him
Yeah.
up. But I was so eager to do it, I did earlier.
He he was, I have to show
You have a
this. I don't
picture
know
of
if it's
it.
I don't know if it's gonna come
Well,
up here. Can you
If
see
you
it?
hold it up just a little bit, I do get a picture of it. Yes.
Okay.
I'm looking at the screen behind the camera.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
I have a picture. That's my aunt and uncle, and
Mm-hmm.
I one of the last pictures that was taken of them, and I have that in my office
Uh-huh.
because I feel that he should be in a law library.
Mm-hmm.
And the relationship, it's actually the blood relationship is through my aunt. She was my father's mother's sister.
Uh-huh.
They had 3 children. There was my grandmother and a brother in the middle, and then my aunt. Very close family. My grandmother had 2 children, and each of the other siblings each had 1. I think my aunt was significantly younger than my grandmother, such that I think my father may have been at their wedding. My Aunt Sylvia and Uncle Julie, I think he was actually present at their wedding. So that's how far back it goes. As I said, each of the other siblings only had 1 child. So the family was very close. The cousins were very close. And so growing up, I'm Jewish. And I know, which was, you would never guess from Bernstein, right, that I was Jewish. But
Or being related to Julius, who was also Jewish and very proud of it.
Exactly.
As he should have been.
We had Seders at our house.
Uh-huh.
My father led the Seders, and my Aunt Sylvia and Uncle Julie and their daughter would come to they were always, they were guaranteed for one night. So we always spent one night of Passover with them, and they would come for the Seder. And I was always excited to see them because my uncle was, he was small in stature. That whole
Yes.
family was kind of tiny, but just so. He had a sparkle in his eye.
Yeah.
He really had a sparkle in his eye and was just always, he was witty and full of life and just it was like a contagious, fun personality, but also very intelligent, that was clear. And I would just love it when they would come. And so I always kept in touch with them. And then I remember when I went to law school, I went to Harvard, and then when I graduated, I took legal research, actually. I took a legal research class at Harvard that was taught by Virginia Wise.
Uh-huh.
And at the time, I remember I went up to her and said, I don't know if you know my uncle, because anyone, I said, but he was the director at the law library there. And so I took Virginia's class. And then he was very interested. Whenever I would see him when I was in law school, he'd ask me, so what are you learning? How do they, and at that time, everything was Lexis and Westlaw, right? That's what we were
That's
learning.
right, yeah.
So he'd be like, and, and so I guess now I can see what he was getting at, but he was very interested in that. And then after I graduated and was working, I was living in Manhattan. I lived on the Upper East Side, and they lived on the Lower East Side. And they would come up, and we would have dinner. And he would ask me again about research and practice. And oh, okay, so that's that's how things are done. He was very interested in that. And then unfortunately, he passed away before I decided to become a librarian, so I wasn't able to
He would have been
connect with
thrilled,
him.
I suspect, if he'd known you were going
Yeah.
in this direction career-wise.
But he did have a big effect. So I guess Julius is my great uncle.
Yes.
My uncle, his nephew, told me, because my uncle went to NYU for law school. And he went there when my Uncle Julie was the law library director. And he told me that my Uncle Julie was the reason that he went to law school and had, a big impact on his life. It's why he went to NYU. And he told me he used to study and do his work in my uncle's office. So,
Well, as
That
I
was just kind of
recall, that
interesting.
library, the office was not exactly in the middle of everything.
it wasn't, and I
So it
do.
would have been quiet, and you wouldn't be disturbed a lot. I think.
And I remember it had a green, padded leather door,
Yes.
upholstered. It was a very strange, but I remember even before, I must have been there at some point, because I remembered that when the first time I went to go and meet Radu, I remembered that door.
Mhm.
So,
Well, an interesting side thing about your uncle and actually his generation of law librarians, at least at the director level. He was president back in the early 60s of ALL. And the annual meeting for his year as president was actually, unlike most, it was held
Is that the
on
one in Mackinac?
Mackinac Island in Upper Michigan,
Mhm.
where they were literally taken out in boats and left at the for the hotel, the Grand Hotel over there, and they're sort of trapped. So they had to sort of fend for themselves.
Right.
And the information about that, the proceedings, are in the Law Library Journal. I think it was 1963, or a year one side or the other, but it is an interesting read. They put on skits that they wrote about each other, and it had a great deal of fun. But it also shows you how dramatically different ALL and its meetings were in that era.
Yes.
The number of participants in meetings was, just maybe 200 to 300 people.
Right.
They all knew each other in a way that even today we don't get that. We can't do that because we're bigger, a lot bigger, and
Right.
more diverse.
Well-
And you see that era. It's a slice of the association, probably from about the end of World War II until about that era when it started to change again and get larger and more diverse.
Well, I think my cousin, my aunt and my cousin used to go as well to these meetings. They didn't go to the meetings, but they came to the conference and, or to the site anyway. And my cousin asked me, his daughter, and said, "Oh, do they still sing the song?" And I said, song? I had no idea what she was talking about. And I reached out to some other folks and like, oh, sure, there was a song, you know. And so it's just kind of fun
I've
to
heard the
see.
song a couple of times. I wouldn't dare try and recite it from behind the camera here because I get it completely wrong probably. But yes, they had that. They had a big banner for a few years. They used to put up above the executive board at the head table, and I don't know, that disappeared at some point, but I guess that's just how things
Yeah.
happen.
I mean, I do also remember that my uncle I remember like when he went to China,
Uh-huh.
and my aunt would get to go with him on all these great trips, and my grandmother would tell me, your uncle was invited by the government of China, and, you know, so I can't even believe I'm going to admit this on the video, but I will. I sort of had a nickname for my uncle. When he doesn't know, nobody knows, except good friends from law school. When I would talk about him, I called him the law god.
The law
The
guy.
law god,
Well,
because
it
that's
was
just
sort
kind of, you know,
yeah.
that was just sort of the nickname.
Yeah.
And so I remember when he got to go to China and they had, you know, these big meetings. And so, you know, I sort of I knew that he was important in what he did, but, you know,
Well,
I was outside of it at the
that
time.
he was. That was definitely the case. He was a major figure when I first joined the association, and for a number of years later, even as he got into his latter years, he still came to annual meetings, participated actively in the affairs of the association. I remember at one business meeting, I forget the issue that was under discussion, but he spoke quite eloquently about trying to preserve what he thought was the traditions, and there were some people that wanted to make some changes, but and I don't remember what finally was resolved, but Julius was a participant even up till the very end, in a positive sense of that.
One thing that was fun for me when I first became a law librarian and then went to my first AALL, like as a law librarian, not as a student, you know, recently graduated student looking for a job, was to meet the people that knew him, right? I know that he had been active. Obviously, he had a big connection and a long-standing relationship with Dick Spinelli.
Yes.
So I met Dick, and, you know, Dick grew up in the town next to Hackensack, which is right next door to Paramus, and we had this big bonding, and so he told me all kinds of stories about my uncle.
Yeah.
But then I also met, you know, I know that my uncle was involved with Oceana, and oh gosh, now I
They did a
forgot
lot
the
of
name.
consulting there.
I
Yes.
forgot the name. Rothman, with Fred
And Fred Rothman,
Rothman,
yeah.
and then I met his son.
Paul.
I met Paul Rothman. We were both at something we were invited to, and it was fun to meet these people. And then I went, at the time there was Jim McHugh, and I forgot what
Oh, he
group-
was with Oceana.
Oh, that's why.
Yeah.
Okay, so and he had a booth. He hasn't been there the last number of years, but at the beginning when I first started, he had a booth at AALL, and I would go and I would chat with him, and he'd tell me stories about my uncle. And I think one of my favorite stories that he told me was that he said, you know, this is where your uncle would be during the meetings, and people would come over and talk. So it was just nice to have that just sort of sense of, I don't know, tradition or continuity or something. So it was, you know, it was fun. And when I go to these meetings, I still do think, you know, the back of my mind, I always tell my cousin, you know, when I go, and
Well, the meetings as they are today are in some ways very different from the era that your great uncle was part of. But
yeah.
times change, needs change,
Yeah.
and you know everything, and the association has to change with it. So as it did, and probably will continue to do. There's one question I sort of went over earlier
Yeah.
because we were engaged, and that is following up on something about you as a person. And that is, do you have any hobbies or special passions that
Oh,
you
yeah.
occupy time with?
I do. You know, one of the things in moving out to Utah, which, as you can imagine, a Jewish girl from New Jersey, was not on my radar screen. If you asked me to pick a state I never thought I would live in, this might have been it. But I was always attracted to the mountains. I don't know why. I never lived near mountains, but there was just something in me that has just felt the urge. And so one of the draws, I said, well, you know, I've never been to Utah. And when I came to interview, and I was like, you know, it's in the mountains, and, you know, that could be fun. Well, I've really gotten into hiking. And I love, and the mountains are so close by here. So on the weekends, like that's
Literally
what you do.
right on the outside of town.
Yeah, like 20 minutes,
Yeah.
30 minutes, you're at a trail. You know, there are trails all over. So
Mm-hmm.
I've really gotten into hiking and just, I never camped before. You know, that was not a, I think my family's idea of camping was probably the Holiday Inn, you know, but I've actually like camped in a tent now. And so that's been really fun getting more involved in the outdoors. And we've got so many national parks here. It's just beautiful.
Oh, and some beautiful ones,
Yeah.
especially down sort of to the south a little bit, down
Yes.
towards St. George area, which is, several hours drive
Yes.
south of the Salt Lake City.
Yeah. I also do love to travel, and I am known to take somewhat exotic trips. The more exotic, the better. I don't like to go places other people, if it's like Iceland was on my list, but now it's too popular, so I got to find something else that's a little more, off the beaten path. I've gone trekking in Nepal. I've gone on safari in Africa. So I love traveling, and I try and work that in when I can. I also do volunteer here. There is a wonderful organization that I think has roots in Utah called Best Friends Animal Society. They have a big animal reserve down in Kanab, Utah, but they've got local efforts as well. So I'm active with them. I actually volunteer at a kitten nursery during the season where they feed the orphaned orphaned kittens until they are able
Do you do
to
any
be adopted.
foster care of any of the kittens?
I have not been a foster yet. I have a cat, and she is not fond. She is an only cat.
Well, cats
So-
tend to be rather territorial.
Yes.
It takes a rather concerted effort to introduce a new cat. I've been through this
Yes.
at home.
And I have not tried that yet. So I get my fix by volunteering with the, at the nursery. So I've been involved with them.
One of our retired colleagues, Carolyn Ahern, whom I visited on this trip, and she's also, there's a video about her career in the collection. She had a cat that I saw that it looked like the cat had been in a fight the night before because the ears are all messed up.
Oh,
But
yeah.
it turned out the cat was frostbitten
my
early on,
goodness.
and this is the result of that.
Wow.
But Carolyn is a foster parent for that cat and has been now for 2 or 3 years. So,
Oh, goodness.
and the kitty is on in years, so it's probably a permanent arrangement.
Yes,
She
yes.
said something about maybe dropping the word foster
Yeah.
from her title at this point.
Yeah.
So you're into animal rights. Now, I'm not totally surprised, and I'll clip this out if you order me to do so, but here in the
Oh, with
library, you have a dog
Yes.
on the premises, a very delightful
We do.
dog. And now that we've introduced
Oh.
her, do you want to say anything more
Well,
about that?
she is the dog of one of our librarians.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately, I am not entirely sure why, but as long as we sort of keep her in the back and keep her quiet, nobody seems to mind. And I love her, and she is, she brings just a little little light whimsy to the day. You get off a horrible conference call, which is really frustrating, and you see this cute dog, and it's wonderful. She gets me out, right? Because there's a few days a week where her owner goes and swims at lunchtime, so I actually take her on walks around campus, and it's good for me because otherwise I would sit at my desk. I recommend that every library have a pet.
Well, you're not the
If
first
it's
one I've
possible.
heard about.
Yeah.
When I was at Yale the other day, again on this trip, talking to a number of our colleagues, I found out that they had a comfort dog, they call it. I have no idea if that dog was officially certified
Right.
or anything, but
Right.
I didn't meet any dogs there on my trip. But
Yeah.
they had one. I guess it was one of Blair Kaufman's things when he was the head of the library there.
She has a fan club. People come to visit her.
Uh-huh.
The students, some of the students know her and want to come back and visit her. So she's, it's a nice little addition.
Well, Melissa, we're probably nearing the end of today's conversation since we've moved sort of off of the normal
Off the
beaten
script.
track
I know.
and the script. But before we do, it's customary to ask if there's anything we've not mentioned that you'd like to bring up.
I think there is actually one of the questions that I know you typically ask is about mentors.
Oh, yes.
And if I had any mentors or who, and I think this has been a really interesting profession.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I've been fortunate to have a lot of mentors. There's no one person, but I think I just want to express that and appreciate that. You know, I was fortunate enough to work for 3 directors when I was in Texas in my short
Roy Murski
period.
as a mentor.
Roy Murski,
Yeah.
I worked with Terry Martin, who was there briefly,
That's
and then I
right.
got to work with Barbara Bentliff.
Yeah.
And then when I moved out here, then I had Jeannie Price, who's at UNLV.
Mhm.
She was one of the people who hired me, right? And I worked with Jeannie. She's a very good friend and has
Mhm.
been, you know, she was a director before me, so she's someone I always call. You know, I could call with any question, no matter how stupid,
Mhm.
and that's terrific. And then when I moved out here, there's the informal group known as Desert States. Are you familiar with the Desert States?
Heard a little bit about
group?
that.
I think-
Tell me a little more about
Yeah,
it.
I don't
for
know how
our
it started.
viewers. Yeah.
I honestly don't know how it started, but it's the librarians, and it's not even all desert states because Wyoming's in there, but it's the library directors in Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming. And I think that may be it.
Well, if Colorado could be in it, I think
Right,
Wyoming
it's
is
just
a
sort
fair
of-
choice.
And they would get together, I think originally it was twice a year or whatnot,
Uh-huh.
and just meet and talk about issues and whatnot. And so, and some of those directors, I don't, you know, are kind of legendary, like, you know, Mike Chirazi and Tori Trotta. And so, you know, now there's some, you know, very well respected directors in this group.
Mm-hmm.
And it was great because that's another sort of group that I use as, you know, mentors or, you know, for advice or,
Mhm.
you know, how are people dealing with this? And, you know, there's just such a range, I think, of people in this profession. And I think I like to think that I learn from everyone
Mhm.
that I work with at any level. And so I'm just really thankful for the camaraderie and the mentorship in the profession, and I hope to continue that tradition. I like to be as open and helpful and encouraging to younger and sort of up and coming people as possible because I know how helpful it was for me. So I just wanted to make sure that I got that in. to
Well, I
this.
think it's important to mention because these similar groups exist elsewhere, sort
Mhm.
of groups. We had one in sort of the D.C. area, but it included Maryland and Virginia.
Right.
And we used to get together maybe once a year at somebody's library. And one
Mhm.
time all of us in D.C. sort of piled into one car to go down to Lexington, Virginia, which is about a 4-hour drive,
Oof.
which compared to here, you know, it's nothing compared to the drives here. But Bob Oakley was in the car, and he was relatively new to Georgetown at the time, and that's when we all got to know him so well. A wonderful colleague, and met him on a very personal basis, just talking about whatever on
Yeah.
the drive down and back.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there are a little side benefits to those groups that one wouldn't normally think of until you notice that they've happened.
Yeah.
Beyond that, Melissa, I should thank you for participating and taking the time and effort to talk with me in front of the camera today for our oral history. And in thanking you, I'm thanking you not just on my behalf, but also on behalf of Michelle Wu, Frank Hodak, and Dick Spinelli, with whom I have the pleasure and honor of working to put together this oral history of law librarianship for the Hein Online database. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Pat.